let's get ready for Scott Nelson. He just moved from Atlanta to London. And Sweetbridge, Vinay Gupta is working in their team. Also, Don Tapscott is working in their team. They have done so much research. And the interesting thing is that what they also found out is that you need basically all the compliance to the regulatory frameworks at the protocol level. So perhaps not even on the organizational level, if you're a wallet provider or an exchange, but actually on the protocol level, because what happens when the wallet provider is not an organization, or if the exchange is fully distributed and does not have any legal entity, or well, maybe in Malta and Gibraltar or anywhere, but you get across different types of conversations then, and I think those are really interesting when they own themselves. Anyway, Scott, I'm eager to learn what you have learned. Take it away. A warm hand of applause.
Thank you.
Scott Nelson, please.
And I can't believe how perfectly you set this up for me. This is a personal journey. I'm going to talk about some things that the space doesn't talk about. I'm going to get dirty. I'm going to reveal things that nobody reveals, and I'm going to talk about the bad, the good, and the ugly. Because if we don't have honest conversations and if we're not transparent, we can't actually fix things. To kind of begin with, I don't know what you think of Buckminster Fuller, but he had an interesting set of architectural innovations, one of which was the geodesic dome. And he said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And we have taken that at heart. We believe that to create a new model is the right answer if you want to actually make something better. And the regulatory concerns of governments are valid. They are based on hundreds of years of bad things happening, of people doing and manipulating financial systems, of people stealing money, of defrauding and harming others, of manipulating instruments, of doing all sorts of bad things. And in the last 30, 40 years, there has been massive improvements in anti-money laundering worldwide. Massive. And we have, for the first time, actually done things that no government's going to walk away from, such as improve GDP by actually bringing more of what's happening out of the gray market or black market into the white market. And in new technologies, when they evolve, a lot of people focus on the technology, but the really important thing is always to look at the model. The technology is valuable and interesting. In the internet, we created a new business that's generating about $130 billion a year of tools, website creation, web hosting, all the things that are the technology-related stuff. But just one new business model that was enabled by the internet, online shopping, is $2.5 trillion, growing at 22% a year. This is way faster than any other economic sector in all of economic activity worldwide. And if that continues, we'll completely absorb the vast majority of all the way we purchase goods and services in society. So new models are really the thing to focus on. Now, I want to suggest that we have entirely missed the point of Bitcoin on this, the anniversary of the white paper being published 10 years ago. I want to introduce this from a different point of view. It is not about a financial instrument, though it is. It's not that you can speculate and create something that doesn't have any value backing it at all. We had tulips before, so we kind of understand that. It's that you can create a reward system that gets people to spend hundreds of millions of euros a month on hardware and electricity to run the world's largest computer network, 10 times larger than all of the financial of the computing power of the Fortune 500 companies combined, that's never gone down and never been hacked, has no central board of directors, has no organizational structure whatsoever, and is entirely driven by a reward system. Now that is actually new. Speculative instruments were not new. That is not the news flash. 100 years from now, that will not be the thing we go back and say, wow, that was the big deal. The blockchain enables something truly new, truly unique, and that is that the commons can replace the firm. That is not that the commons will replace the firm. I'm not saying that there are not going to be firms, but I'm saying that this is the new economic evolution. This is transformative. This is as big as what happened here in the creation of the West India Company, and the East Indian Company, thank you. And the trading that was empowered because of the risk pooling of sending ships that would mostly not return. That was a big deal. And creating the corporate structure, the identity of the firm, was a big transformation. This is a bigger transformation than that. Now, we can do this with rewards that are kind of scary and a bit weird. First, we can now create new financial instruments that haven't been able to exist before. We can use something other than money as a reward, and this is good because we don't need to actually increase the money supply and risk inflation to basically do this. And we can create truly decentralized entities. These are entities which act like a firm, have pooling of capital, have pooling of risk, and have pooling of production, but which are not a firm in the sense that they are not centrally managed and they are operated for the benefit of the group. Now the problem is that with any new idea, we have a tendency to compare the new idea with the existing model. And the new ideas are clunky, they're risky, they're new, so they aren't very well thought through. They have lots of problems. You don't want to get on that airplane and fly across the Atlantic Ocean. That would be a very bad idea. It's also not a really good replacement for the moving of large quantities of freight compared to a freight train. But it was a fundamentally important invention. And the thing that we so frequently miss is that technologies evolve, and they are right now evolving faster and faster than we've ever seen before. As of this year, we are now reinventing the entire knowledge base of the world every something between 90 and 120 days. Let that sink in. What I mean by that is that the amount of accumulated knowledge is doubling every 90 to 120 days. Okay? That's a stunning thing. And if you've worked in this space, a year in this space is like a decade in any other thing I've ever been involved with. And I was involved with the internet. Now, let's talk about the good, the bad, the ugly. The imposable thumb turns out to be a really big deal. And this is about, let me give you the analogy. The internet was like my fingers, my 4 fingers. I can push things around with my 4 fingers real easy. But it's not real good at grabbing and holding on to things. And that's really important. But the opposable thumb allows me to actually grab a hold of something and actually manipulate it. And it makes me a tool user. It allows me to manipulate that. The blockchain is much more than a distributed ledger that distributes state across people that they can trust. It is the first framework we have of being able to own and control value that does not have to have an intermediary. And that is a really big deal. Now, cryptocurrencies, as the new model of using this, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, tokens of different kinds, were really 1 step forward and 2 steps back. So the 1 step forward was you could do this without an intermediary. That was a big deal. That was a big deal. The 2 steps back is that we went back to a single ledger. In a single ledger, the problem is that ownership and possession are the same thing. Now, about 400 years ago, 500 years ago, we figured out that was a really bad idea. And we created something called the double entry accounting system to be able to account for the separation of ownership and possession. Because before, the only way you knew how much you had is you walked into the treasury and you said, well, how much gold is in the treasury? You know, based on that pile of gold, I'm doing pretty good. Now, you could basically owe all that money to somebody else, but you wouldn't know about it. And so our entire financial framework is not based on ownership and possession being the same thing. In fact, all of our legal framework for value transfers, all of our institutions, the entire economic framework structure we have is based on ownership and possession being able to be separated. But we went backwards. The other thing we went backwards with is we lost a lot of the enhancements to prevent abuse of the financial system. The ability to use it for money laundering, the ability to use it for transferring things in ways that are not positive or healthy, the ability to manipulate markets and do a lot of other things that are involved. And ICOs and tokens really brought out the worst in markets. They didn't do anything we didn't already know what people would do if they have unfettered markets, but they really did bring out the worst in markets. And we need to admit that, because if we don't admit that, what happens is really bad things will occur. We either leave it the wild, wild west, and in the wild, wild west, the guy with the biggest gun wins. That's what happens in the wild, wild west. We get dystopia. You don't want dystopia. Or we put together some kind of legal framework. Now, for Sweetbridge, it was really important for us to use blockchain. A lot of people use blockchain because it's a fad. It's good. Oh, look at this. It's great. I can raise a lot of money. You know, there's a lot of reasons. But we had some really sound reasons for using it, and I thought we should discuss them for a second. One is we needed to tokenize value trapped in assets. We wanted to take the non-risky portion of value out of all sorts of different asset classes and create a new asset. And the blockchain allowed us to do this through tokenization. The second is we wanted to convert discounts into an asset. Now, people don't think of discounts as being something you could ever be an asset, but this is actually one of the most incredible financial tricks of all time, that you can do this. It's as fundamental a shift as the creation of a bond. And in fact, it's the inverse of a bond, because it gives you lower future costs for an expense today. And there's all sorts of places in reality where this occurs, but we can't tokenize it, and you can't actually implement this in a way that's transferable, fungible, and universal that works outside of, say, an airline or some other, you know, Starbucks program or something. You can't actually do this unless you have a payment system that you can tap into and actually monitor for transactions. Well, the blockchain allows that. We wanted to be able to eliminate counterparty risk in trade. Counterparty risk is actually one of the most artificial and yet real. How could it be artificial and real? Well, it's artificial in that it's measured through artificial means. It's real in that it really occurs, and people get screwed if they basically order something and pay for it and then don't get the goods. This is a bad problem, okay? And so it's very open to abuse, but most of the risk isn't real. You can actually solve this problem with blockchain. And finally, we realized that you have to have a regulatory compliant environment, but in the commons and the decentralized, how do you do this? If you don't have a firm to basically report, if you can't do the eyeball thing to somebody, how do you know who the customer is? How do you make sure that the money that's being sent through the system isn't being used for nefarious purposes and that it didn't come from a nefarious source? So I want to focus on that. What we did is we went around the world and we started talking to regulators, financial ministries, lawyers, all sorts of people, anyone who would talk to us, frankly, about what would you want? Not what can we get away with, but in the ideal world, what do you want, and why do the things, the regulations you have, why do they exist? What problem are they trying to solve? And we found some really common problems. So anonymity is really not a very good thing in commerce. It's very highly prized in wealth accumulation. Nobody wants people to know how much money you have in the vault, but it's not highly prized in commerce. And in commerce, it's actually a really big problem, and it's at the heart of KYC and AML. And what we found is that of the countries we talked to, universally they did not like the idea of anonymity because they had had lots of experience with it over hundreds of years where it went wrong. And so that's something that should be listened to. The other thing is no recourse. The recourse is a result of possession and ownership being the same thing. No recourse is. In recourse, what this means is if there's a lawsuit or some kind of judgment or somebody doesn't fulfill their duty, can you go and get the money back? Is there a way to use the legal system or to use some kind of dispute resolution process to get made whole when somebody defrauds you? The problem with the existing version of cryptocurrencies was that the attacks are all on the edge. All of the risks are now pushed to the consumer. And the simplest attack is the rubber hose. This is very bad. And if the consumer loses their, private key, God forbid, they lose all their money. Who thinks this is a good idea? A bunch of crazy people, but that's not a good idea. There is no built-in compliance reporting. So there is no way to detect, monitor, report on bad actors. If we want to be honest, how many people have ever done a Bitcoin or Ethereum transaction? Okay, almost everybody in the room. Is it instantaneous? No. No, come on. So send it to an exchange, and how long will it be before they allow you to actually start using it? No, it's because there can be your block might get pruned. Okay? Your block might get pruned. How many people have actually set a transaction and then not had it actually get picked up because you didn't put enough money in? And CryptoKitties was kind of the all rage. Yeah. So, so look it's if you compare that with what exists in the payment systems that we have today, it stinks. It stinks. It can't handle even 100th of the processing volume of what happens just in this nation, let alone the entire volume of the kind of financial infrastructure. And then the public privacy debate. This is really an artificial problem, but everybody seems to want to talk about it, which is what we found is that regulators really didn't know how to think about this. We need certain things to be available to us, but we also recognize that, that could be bad because people could do things like stalk people or find out things that they shouldn't be able to find out if this stuff isn't protected somehow. And so it really needs to be private. But at the same time, we understand that there's this thing called accountability and transparency that's a good thing, and there's really kind of a debate about this. And so these were all the things that we found that were things people pointed out as defects in the original systems. And so we felt that the solution to this was to rethink the systems and ask the question, can we use the technology itself to basically rebuild the stuff? And the answer was yes. And so what we did is we said, can you build KYC AML in? And I'm going to show you how you can build KYC AML in to the tech at the protocol level in a way nobody can get around. Any regulator can verify. Any police force with the proper right can exercise. And these are the list of things that we found that were common for 17 of the G20 nations that we talked to. These were the common concerns they wanted. And it wasn't, again, the question wasn't, what do you have to let me do something? The question was, what would you like? What would make you comfortable with this? Now, CIP is Customer Identification Process. And what this means is, how do you identify and know that when the transaction is occurring, that the person is doing that transaction versus some other party doing it, at that time, okay? You need to do that, and that's very different than KYC, which is all about knowing, what customer it is, what their business is, where the money comes from, that they're not some, actor that's acting on behalf of another party. And then payment information processes, which in the United States are things like CTR reporting. You have your own, and every nation, they have their own. This is the questionable transaction stuff, the things that you need to report that might be suspicious or that exceed some level of reporting. You can build this into the tech. So the tech will just do this. And you can use all sorts of very common, sophisticated tooling that exists now, such as AI and other things, to look for the stuff that might be AML. And you can do this without a person actually having to actually do it, and you can actually determine whether or not it happened, and you can actually make sure that when it needs to learn some new behavior or look for some new risk, that it gets applied, and you can also make sure that nobody can get around it. Now, recourse and identification, customer protection, everybody was concerned about customer protection, and this has to do with how do you protect customers from being defrauded, how do you protect them from being somehow taken advantage of. And then trade and tax compliance. So in international transactions, can you enforce the compliance of the transaction at a transaction level? That would be the ideal thing. And on tax, can you charge the tax real time? So we worked on that. And what we found is that if you look at the problem at its kind of, think of it molecularly. There are 4 basic systems that have to work together and all be synchronized in order for you to do these things in RegTech. The first is the identity of people, entities, and assets. The second is both the legal framework in which this is happening, the legal jurisdiction, the laws that are covering it, what's the regulatory requirements, and the contracts, the legal contracts between the parties. The third is the accounting treatment. Is this a purchase? Is this a receivable for which you should have a payable? Is this a loan? What is it? And finally is the payment. In today's world, these are run by completely separate systems. And what we found is that most of the regulation had been created and most of the enforcement activity had been created because these are separate systems and people will manipulate them. That's why they're there, is people do manipulate them. In fact, almost all financial crime and almost all fraud come through one manipulation or errors in one of those areas. And the reason is, to synchronize these things is an n squared minus n problem. For those in computer science, you'll know what that means. But it means that n is the number of parties, squared is the number of by the number of reconciliations, minus the number of parties is the number of things you have to reconcile with one another. In this example here, there are 12. But it's worse than that, because you have to be able to do this across all counterparties in a transaction. It's not just whether your belief is that this is all okay. The only way you can actually prevent abuse and fraud is if all of the parties take the exact same view. So they all agree, yes, we are operating in this legal jurisdiction on this transaction. They all agree that, yes, this is the actual contract that's involved. They all agree that, yes, these are the parties, this is the person who's doing this, they have the authority to do this, and these are the assets that we're actually doing this with. You have to get this all to occur and all agree. Well, the beauty is you can actually create technology now that will do this and enforce it at a level. Now, this had a side effect we didn't anticipate initially, and the side effect is that when you chain these together, it becomes almost impractical to conduct any kind of money laundering activity. And the reason is twofold. One, there is now entire traceability of a series of transactions to all the parties, all the accounting treatments, all the legal agreements, all the legal jurisdictions in which it happened, all the way back through a series of transactions that occur in that system. The second is it would cost so much money to basically try to use it to money launder that nobody would pick that. And the reason is you would have to actually set up all sorts of fake organizations, conduct real transactions, which are very frictionful. You would lose tons of money by doing that. And you would have to do a ton of work. In fact, each time you add another link to this chain, so the more and more and more of these links you have, the cost goes up logarithmically. That's right, the cost goes up logarithmically to lie. And so we saw in this the answer to a lot of problems. But there's one other side effect that we realized that you needed. If you do this all within a sealed system that uses a virtual currency, not a cryptocurrency that you can trade on an exchange, that means you can't lose anything, you can't steal anything, and you have entire recourse to unravel anything in the system. And all of the risk is on the boundary to the existing system at the exchange. So it's when you go out to fiat that you inject risk. Inside the container, you have very, very, very little risk. In fact, almost all the risk inside the container, I would argue, you can basically hedge. So the result was that a properly designed system could make it difficult to lie, cheat, and steal, and could be fully compliant. We believe it is, that this structure is fully compliant. We would love to talk to you guys about that. And at the same time, preserve privacy, where governments have to have a right, based on their legal context, to get access to the information. And our recommendation is for governments that, look at, if you can build the regulatory tech in, that ought to be the thing that we look to do, because adding more enforcement layers, kind of using the old world structure, may not work for things that are in the commons. And the power of enabling the commons is too great. Now I want to turn my attention to ICOs. There are good things about ICOs. We actually ran an ICO, and let me tell you, it is very, very difficult to do an ethical ICO. It is very difficult to do KYC AML at a high level of KYC AML, and not lose money. We lost tens of millions of euros over what we could have raised because we said no. Tens of millions of euros. And that's because we actually did do rigorous KYC and rigorous AML. And then we lost almost another 10 million euros, even though we had done the KYC AML, even though we had worked with banks and exchanges in advance to approve our process, even though we were told we had the most rigorous process they had ever seen in the space. Universally, no one has ever told us that there was anyone that had a better process than ours. Even though all that was true, once we raised the money and we went to them to try to exchange it to fiat, it took 4 months. During that period of time, the market crashed. Now, we could have done what everyone else did. Do you know what people were telling us to do? Oh, hey, just go to Asia. You can go there, you can just basically convert everything to Bitcoin, take the Bitcoin, run it through an exchange to a liquidity provider. The liquidity provider will then take it back, run it through another exchange, and give it to you through an account that you basically just set up for yourselves, and basically you're a crypto trader. Go onto this exchange, sign up as a crypto trader, and you'll be able to get this money. That's a true story. That's money laundering. We said no. It cost us $9 million. So why do it? Well, there's some good things about it, okay? You can actually fund a commons. Now, VCs will not fund a commons. Corporations might, but VCs won't. You can create a better alignment of interests. You can actually get rid of the disinterest of the shareholder. The shareholder in an existing corporation is not interested in the same things as the customers or the employees are. And the shareholder is the one who the company or the firm is run for, not the employees, not the customers. I was a CEO of a venture capital-backed company. It was quite successful. International firm that I built, sold to the largest companies in the world. Eventually sold it to a PE firm and retired. While I was a CEO, I was repeatedly reminded that the decision I was making needs to be made to the benefit of the shareholders, not the customers, and definitely not the employees. That's a true story. It separates ownership from governance. This is an important thing. This is a really good thing because governance of companies, particularly startup companies, if they're VC funded, let me tell you, the VCs have one and only one interest, which is maximizing their return on investment for their partnership and for the person who's on the board to get the biggest dang bonus they can possibly get. Let's just be honest, okay? That is the motive. And as long as you know that, that can be okay, but separating ownership from governance means that you can actually now create environments that have the behavior of a for-profit entity, but which are governed like a nonprofit organization, where the people who are there are governing it for the benefit of the commons, not governing it for the benefit of themselves. Decentralization of capital formation and the democratization of that are big deals. We need to do this. We can't just have the wealthiest people have access to doing this. And crowdfunding is a really good model to get a community to build a product or service that they want. Now the bad. The market is driven by hype. The ethics are amazingly questionable. Most crypto events I leave, I feel like I have to take a shower. It's highly controlled by large money players. It is not the retail guy. 80–90% of all the money that goes into these things comes from large funds, whales, and other things. Forget what everybody else says. It's all fake. It's not true. It's difficult. It's difficult to be successful and act ethically. I cannot tell you how many arguments that were had, how many battles that occurred because we had to say no. Nor how much our community crucified us for that. I know very few people that can stand up to the pressure of actually saying no to somebody who walks in and says, look, I've got a bag here of cash. I'd like to give it to you. I'd like to buy some of your tokens. I'll pay extra. I said no. Most projects are poor quality. It's going to be a high failure rate. And the token economics for the ones that aren't securities, and even for the ones that are securities, are almost all flawed. I'm being kind at saying 90% actually is the number. It's well above that. Now, the really ugly part of the space, when you do try to do something for the commons, you have to publish it. You have to put it out there. And everything we've done, we've published and put out there, been totally transparent, shared all the math, shared all the information. We can prove that we have 6 and growing copycats, people that literally copied our math. Because we knew that our math would be copied, we injected an error. There are 6 projects out there who raised combined multiple times what we raised, who did nothing but did it by copying our stuff. All of them are for profit. One of them is run by a really, really big company. Exchanges control the market. They're mostly into manipulation. Most of the trading volume isn't real. The liquidity is not really there. Mostly it's wash trading and market making. The market making is largely false. It's mostly run by people that are desperate to pump and dump. What's the floor of something that has no value? As soon as you put futures on it, I was at a very interesting presentation by CME Group, who runs the futures market for Bitcoin, where one of their analysts basically presented an unbelievably compelling argument that the current crash in the price of crypto occurred as a result of the futures market. And the reason is there is no bottom. With real commodities, there's a bottom. There's a place at which useful use of that commodity, like eating or building some product, cause somebody to go, man, I'm going to go buy a year's supply of that stuff because that's a good deal right now. and you go off and get a bunch of it. Not there. The retail buyer pays the most. The real truth is that funds in the space typically get an 70 to 80% discount. Most of that's hidden. It's hidden in things like advisory fees and other things. We've refused to do every single one of these, and as such, we decided not to take money from funds early on in the project. What the retail buyer pays is a lot more, and they use that to basically justify the exchange listing price and then make a bunch of money. And the value's fake. So there's actually something behind that slide. I don't know why it's not showing, but the good news is the free market kind of worked and the bubble burst. So we're now in this trough of disillusionment, and we're in crypto winter, and this is the perfect time to get the model right. Because we will come out of it. This is really something good. A lot of bad things have happened, but there's a lot of good things that can be done. And the lesson that we learned is you can do an ICO and do it responsibly and well. I'm sure we screwed up something. It's impossible in this space not to step on a landmine, let me tell you. But we tried. But we need enlightened government. We need governmental help, because what happens when the government isn't engaged is that when they just let it happen, and there's very little understanding of what's good, what's okay, what's not okay, is that primarily what you have is crazily courageous people or bad actors. And the courageous people are small, they're rare, they're few. The bad actors are many, and it creates the Wild West. So you can do one that's ethically and compliantly responsible, but it's really hard. And if you're going to do one, you're going to be tested. You're going to be tempted. So how could we do this better? So our recommendation, after our own experience, is that we need to go beyond sandboxes and beaches and other things that are being proposed. We're in favor of that stuff, but we need to go further than that. And we need to basically do something where I'm a big believer in incubation models. And the model that you have here through Dutch Chain is one of the better ones I know of. And using an ecosystem that brings together corporates, entrepreneurs, and governments together to actually have dialogue and work together and create some things that are okay to do. That this is something, if you do it this way, then we're okay with that. Gives people a path. It gives them a North Star to guide by. And we think that's a good idea. We also think that the Netherlands is in a unique position. I go all over the world and talk to people about this stuff. And the Netherlands has two good things. It's small enough that you can actually get the right people in a room to talk. It's large enough that it has economic scale, so you can do something that's meaningful. But it also has something else that's really unique that's probably only shared by a handful of countries on Earth. And that is this culture of collaboration. There is probably nowhere where I go that people as a culture understand kind of collaborating together in an economic way to actually make something good happen than this country. It's a unique heritage that you have. For a small country, you've had a disproportionate effect on global trade for centuries. And you did that because you came together. And we're looking at the creation of something new, the commons, replacing the firm. And I believe the Netherlands is well placed to potentially be, the people that kind of lead us out of some of that bad and ugly stuff that I referred to into something which is much more positive. I can tell you it will not come from the United States. The United States is too fractured, has too many different hands in the pie. Between the states and the federal government and all the different agencies involved, you can't get anybody in the room, and if you did, there's no way they would ever agree with one another, because as soon as you put them in the room, the cameras would show up and they'd have to basically take political positions. It's also the environment of, kind of free market and rugged individualism. And that's exactly the opposite of what's needed right now, where it needs collaboration. I don't think it's going to happen in Asia. Asia is the wild, wild east right now. And it's an amazing place. If I was a young man, I'd want to be there for my career. But it's trying to out-compete the West. And so it's really into competition. And it's being successful largely because it's doing stuff new. But it thinks it's good. So not really big on collaboration outside of maybe, the Chinese, which do collaboration at a completely different scale, both timeline and otherwise, but it is kind of centrally planned. Anyway, thank you.